I've been looking forward to doing this interview today. From James Gray, the author of the best-selling Max Verstappen, comes the very first biography of Lewis Hamilton's designated successor, George Russell, published to mark the British Grand Prix a couple of weeks ago. Delighted to be welcoming back to the show James Gray. James, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me back again. I must have said enough nice things about you last time.
Well, you know, if you sweet talk my producer, I mean, there's no end to the thing. And you know, as we discovered last time, we are both obviously mutual petrol heads, and everybody else can basically go home now because we'll just natter to ourselves like the two anorak. You know, I've got my anorak ready at the back, so let battle be joined. Basically, now George Russell, he's in that sort of interesting position at the moment, isn't he? Because you get, I'll let you get in a minute, James, don't worry, but you get to a certain position, you go, thundering up through the ranks, you're the bright young thing, you're the great next talent, and the next thing you know, you're an established team, and you've got one of the greatest drivers of all time as your teammate. So let's first of all, George Russell, and it might sound really stupid, but, is he any good?
Well, it's a hell of a broad question. I mean, yeah, short answer, I think he is pretty good. He's come up the slow road, I would say, which is unusual in Formula One. Racing drivers, by their nature, want to be fast in everything they do. And, as you mentioned, I wrote a book about Max Verstappen, and he was in an F1 car, well, actually, by the age of 16. Yeah. But he was in F1 by 17. They changed the rules to stop anyone doing that again. And actually, Russell's kind of come at it the other way and has taken his time up through the ranks and, had those formative years in a shopping trolley at the back of the grid at Williams and then made the move to Mercedes. So it has been a little bit of a slow train to the top. And I don't think he'll necessarily see, this current finding yourself second driver in the team, even though he beat Lewis last year and Mercedes not being the fastest car on the grid. I think he'll take it in his stride more than maybe if he turned up in this situation 5 years ago, which could easily have happened.
I mean, the other thing is the fact that, we talk about Max has gone straight in because he had a sort of an in there, didn't he? Let's face it, because I just dropped it there because his father, he's not backwards and coming forwards, at least when it comes to business dealings. Joss the boss was already an established, Formula One journeyman. If you think with boxers, he'd be a journeyman, wouldn't he? He was good. He stayed the course. He's a good driver. Didn't set the world on fire, but he that was the in. He was already surrounded by the F1 crowd, so he would have already been going cross radar. Whereas George Russell obviously had to come up, the old school way.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I think it's the new school way, because the old school way is the nepotism. That was how F1 always worked, was having the connections and having, hopefully, a family member involved. And yeah, Max went on skiing holidays with the Schumacher family when he was like 4 years old. There can be no better leg up into F1 than, racing Mick Schumacher down the slopes and having dinner with Michael and his family. So, yeah, George has not really had any of that. Look, he's had plenty of financial backing. He comes from a reasonably well-off family, but because they didn't have those contacts in motor racing, they didn't have the kind of financial fuel that others with big contacts and big teams and big sponsors had. And so really from quite a young age, George has had to grow up very quickly, learn how to do a PowerPoint presentation, learn how to shake hands and say how do you do and talk to people much older than him. And I think that's one of his great skills, is that he is phenomenally mature for a 25-year-old.
Yeah, because when you see him, he is, isn't he? He's like a fully grown man. But you know what I'm saying? Yeah. He presents himself very well. He's very dapper. He's very reserved, and he's certainly. You don't see him doing much of the Kimmy stuff, do you? You don't see him falling off the back of a super yacht on an occasion.
No, it's crucial, Giles. You don't see him doing that.
Exactly.
It does happen. I mean, he had a very good New Year's party with Fernando Alonso, I think either last year or the year before, which I don't know how much more I'm allowed to say about it. There's not a lot of it in the book for one reason or another. But he is someone who enjoys that side of life, and he likes a drink. But he also is someone who has worked very hard to get where he is, and yeah, as I say, from quite a young age has had to be quite mature.
So talk us through it then. So he's from East Anglia. Because you get bitten by the bug, don't you? You have to be committed. So what first sort of piques his interest in motor racing in general? Is it watching something? Is it going to a race? Is it being at his local kart track? What is it?
Well, I spoke to him in an interview for the newspaper, which is my day job, a year or two ago, and I sort of asked him that question, and he went, "Oh, well, my grandfather I used to sit on his knee and he'd talk to me about driving cars fast, but I don't think he was ever on a track. I think he was breaking the speed limit. So I think there was a little bit of that, but growing up in the countryside, I think most people in the countryside like driving fast or like mechanics to some extent.
Yeah.
His dad ran a peas and beans. Steve, George's dad, ran a peas and beans business, so there was always machinery involved. But really, the thing that got him into it was his older brother Benji, who is more than 10 years older than him, so quite a lot older. And so pretty much from year dot, there were go-karts around. Benji won a world title in go-karting, but never actually made the jump up to single-seater. So that was always around, and George was always like tooling around the paddock in a little like toy tractor and stuff. So, he had rubber in his blood one way or another.
That's an interesting one. I didn't know about that, about the older brother. And to be world karting champion, people go, oh, it's just karting. It's phenomenally competitive.
Yeah, and it is filled with, once you get to the very highest level in karting, and in KZ, which is the shifting, they don't call it that anymore, but once you get to that highest level, it is a combination of youngsters trying to get into single-seater and pro kart drivers who are in their 20s and 30s. They are paid by the big Italian factories to drive go-karts, and it is, as you say, phenomenally competitive. So yeah, winning a world title, and Benji stuck with it and then eventually went to work in go-karting. He worked as a supplier for one of the big karting companies in the UK, which was a useful contact, no doubt, for George to have someone, working with the suppliers, although, nothing compared to, say, having an F1 driver as a father.
Sure.
But yeah, I think definitely Benji was a big part of it. His mum as well, Alison, initially, George's sister Cara was quite a high-level sort of show jumper. So at the weekends, basically, Steve and Benji would go one way to a go-kart track, Cara and Alison would go the other to a horse riding event, and George would be in the pram, and so he would go with Alison and Cara. But eventually he wanted to go go-karting, and because Steve was away mechanicking for Benji, it was Alison actually who took him to the PFI in Lincolnshire, the Paul Fletcher International, and started just showing him the first ropes and writing down lap times and things. And so it really has been a proper family affair. Like, Cara still works for George, his sister, in a sort of marketing role and executive assistant stuff. So it has been a real, they say it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a more than a village to raise a racing driver.
Absolutely. Was he, as the saying is, because if you believe the urban myth, I mean, Lewis Hamilton just literally leaps in a car and sparks fly, and he's immediately, he sets the land speed record, across the salt flats. Is George quick off the box, or is this a story of, talent, but perseverance and dedication to it as well?
I mean, I think probably, as I've kind of alluded to by the fact that he's 25 and only just in a top team, it has not been a road without bumps. He certainly was quick. I mean, he won his first title at the age of 10, I think, winning Kart Masters. So, it was only against other 10-year-olds, but they all count, and there were some good people he beat. And, he made his way through the ranks in karting. He ended up as part of a go-karting team with Charles Leclerc and Alexander Albon.
Yeah.
He obviously raced raced at the same events as Verstappen, but in a different class for the same team. So, yeah, he was fast, but the real bumps, I think, and funnily enough, he never went into KZ. I mentioned KZ. He never drove a shifting kart. He went straight into British Formula 4, as it was then, which are they're about as small, really, as you can be for single-seaters.
Yeah.
And anyone who's met George or seen him knows that small is not his thing.
Yeah.
He's about 6'2", I think, or 6'3", which for a racing driver is phenomenally tall.
Yeah.
Very rarely over 6 foot. And so he found himself first year in single-seater, not a lot of money, pretty much self-funded, there or thereabouts, and driving these single-seaters that are so small that he actually couldn't straighten his legs in them, which makes the feel of braking very, very difficult and very, very tiring. So he actually went on and won that pretty remarkable, despite everything. Wow. And despite a pretty poor driving standards. And that was kind of, I think, a little bit to people in the know who saw him doing that. They went, oh, okay, this kid can drive. And then there were a few difficult years, and they didn't play the political game maybe in the way that they should have done, and they ran into a team owned by the bloke who wanted to drive as the number one driver, and that kind of thing happened a lot. So he was always quick, I think, and whenever he went for tests at You know, he nearly ended up in DTM driving for BMW. He drove a very, very quick test for them, which, to be honest, was probably the thing that actually got the most important phones ringing, because all of the mechanics in the BMW garage went, this kid is not only quick, he knows what's going on. I think we should talk to other people about him.
Now, that's another thing. So he's got mechanical knowledge as well. Because DTM, obviously, the big players, because it's the Germans, so it's the Mercedes, the BMW, stroke Toyota, whatever you call it. It's the, you know, the Audis, and who knows when they're going to pop on Formula One any day now, etc. So it, you know, and it's an interesting point, because at that point, if you are, because DTM is a very well paid series. You know, it's factory-backed teams. It's, you know, we may not know it much in the UK, but it is the premier touring. I think you can say it's the premier touring cars in the world, basically. And so you pretty much, you can go, okay, well, I want to be a professional driver. I'll go you know, it's done very well for like Luigi Martini back in the day, etc., etc. And there's some huge tracks and you can make a very, very good living doing it. So you might think, oh well, you know, I might not make it up to F1. I'll be a DTM legend.
Yeah, and actually the tracks thing is a really good point, because one of the things of Junior Series is wanting to go and drive at tracks that you might end up driving an F1 test at or something like that. And obviously DTM mirrors bits and pieces of the F1 calendar at the time. And yeah, as you say, it was really well paid. And he pretty much had, well, he did. He had a contract on the table when he was, you know, 17 or 18. They pretty much had got to a point as a family where they said, this is it, we're tapped out financially. We probably can't, you know, just fund this anymore, because once you get to that level, it's like 400 grand a year just to run. And he had an offer on the table from BMW that was a paid driving contract, you know, probably a 6-figure salary. Or he had Mercedes saying, look, we'll give you a 1-year junior driver contract. You can go and drive in F3. We'll cover the cost of that, and then we'll see. And there was so much less stability in that, and he took a punt, and it was probably, I mean, it was the thing that made his career in some ways, was that punt. And he went away and he impressed, and as you mentioned, the mechanical stuff, it's not the fact that he could, you know, take apart his F1 car in the dark. It's the fact that he can go out on a lap and come back in and tell the mechanics exactly what they need to know. He can say, I can feel this, I can feel that, I think we need to change this, I think we need to change that. And that kind of thing is pretty invaluable to an F1 team, because it just makes them move forward so much more.
And here's the thing, because when you look at F1, you go, oh, it's not the driver, it's all the car, you know, they're not real driver. I could drive an F1 car, apart from my neck would fall off. And the thing is, you look, they're looking at data, they can change the pedals, and it's not because, you know, as I shift in my own seat, because, hey, you know, piloting a radio show is pretty much the same as driving an F1 car, obviously, but you get a feeling basically through, and cover your ears, ladies and gentlemen, your bum cheeks, basically, and Nicky Lauda used to say that as well. And you get a feel, and Jim Clark was a master of that. You get a feel of the car from what it's doing and how it's performing and how it's coming in or out or during a corner.
Yeah, and it's a very strange thing, and I've driven some quite high-level F1 sims, and they're very good at replicating that, and you do get the instructor coming in and saying, can you feel this, can you feel that, and I'm like, no, I can just feel vibrations, like my whole body is just
I'm too busy trying not to stick it in the scenery.
Yeah, exactly. To be able to do that kind of high-level stuff, and actually every now and again you get a really great video. There's a channel on Reddit that produces them, and it annotates all the things that the drivers do on a steering wheel during a lap. And, you know, you think it's just gear changes and pedals. Yeah. It's absolutely not. They're changing the brake balance. They're changing, you know, the pressure replications, that everything that they can do on the steering wheel, they are doing during a lap. It's usually about 130 different inputs if you include the steering wheel and the pedal through a lap. And then you're doing that at 200 miles an hour, 70 times. It's an incredible skill, and I think George, beyond all the very sexy stuff like big overtakes and fast lap times, is very good at the minutiae.
Yeah, and he keeps on the tracker, which is what the team wants you to do at the best of times.
Don't crash it.
Don't crash it. Yeah, exactly. I shall mention the ghost of Pasta Maldonado comes behind us now. Looking and we're starting. Andy's off from F3. And then we're going into G. I mean, and also there are these great photos that are coming, because you've got Leclerc, you've got Verstappen, you've got Albon, and you've got George, Albon, Leclerc, and Nando as kids, and now they're all there as. And it's very rare we have that sort of that group coming through. So it is a special generation, and into GP2, F2, whatever, because it's changed its name so many times.
Yeah. He started off in F3 and then he went to GP3 and he won the GP3 title with ART Grand Prix, which I think was a great team for him. He'd had a really difficult year. 2015, he was with Carlin. The car wasn't great, and by his own admission, he didn't deal with it well, and he'd be swearing into the radio and blaming almost anyone he could find and never really searching for the real solution, and just getting angry and frustrated. And he then moved team the next year, went and drove with High Tech. And actually, I spoke to an engineer who asked to be anonymous, because engineers sometimes get a bit funny when you ask them to be really candid about stuff. And he was at Macau the year George drove the Macau Grand Prix, which for people who don't know is a... It's the Monaco of junior racing. It's walls, it's tight, it's F3 cars, and it's where a lot of drivers can really prove themselves. Yeah. And it was wet the year George was there, and he drove some insane time on a very limited number of tyres, and he was second or third because it wasn't the quickest car. And apparently all of the engineers were all pointing at the same bit of the screen going, have you seen what Russell has done in the last 2 hours? This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And that kind of, again, just was that thing. He was making the right people talk about him in the right way. And so he gets into GP3, wins the GP3 title, he moves up to F2, he wins the F2 title, and all of a sudden everyone's going, here is the new Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, but you see, not a given, because, Hamilton, and one of my claims to fame is on this radio show 10, 15 years ago, I said, there's a new kid coming up called Lewis Hamilton, look out for him. Nah, never make it. But it's not a given, because you do get people who win the GP2 title, and yet they think great things, and nothing happens. Zonta, great driver, and of course Nick de Vries. Who recently, got the boot from the Red Bull team, the AlphaTauri that makes the House of Lannister or whatever it is from Game of Thrones look like an episode of CBeebies, doesn't it? Basically, because you're gone in seconds with no whoop, you're gone. That's it. It's the Red Wedding all over again at AlphaTauri.
Yeah, F2's funny because it used to be about a 50% hit rate, I reckon. To produce an F1 champion is neither here nor there, but to produce someone who could establish themselves within Formula One. Because, as you say, Hamilton won it, actually with the same team that George won it, funnily enough. Pierre Gasly won it. Yeah. Pastor Maldonado, your favourite, won it.
Pastor.
Proof that not. But then, Davide Valsecchi and Fabio Lema, also F2 champions, and have largely done nothing. So it's not a complete indicator, but it's an important ththing to have done, because you can put it on your CV, you can wave it at people.
Yeah.
And it gets you tests. If nothing else, they go, we'll put the F2 champion in for our rookie testing. We've got to put someone in who's never driven an F1 car. Let's pick him. Yeah. And it sort of bashes down the door in a way that you can't really replace with anything other than results.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, and a bit of rookie testing. Alonso, for example, in Minardi, and a very good friend of mine who was an Italian F3 champion. He was doing the same test and asked by Minardi why he was a second slower than Alonso, and my mate said because he's something quick. So therefore. He gets a drive at Williams. Now, one of the most evocative names in motor racing, Frank Story, from Piers Courage all the way through. Again, the glory days, Alan Jones, Regazzoni, of course, Nige. But of course, by the time that George comes to it, as you so aptly described it, it's a shopping trolley.
Yeah, it was actually a really fun part of the book to write, because the nice thing about writing a book rather than writing for newspapers is if you want to go off on a tangent, you can. And so I had a lot of fun just being, let's talk about Williams for a while. Why is that a big deal? And it is a fabulous story, and one that will never be replicated in F1 again, this kind of, family project. Not in the same way anyway. The sad thing, I think, for George is that he did come in at the real bitter end of the Williams story. And, of course, it's a whole different story now since it's been bought out. But to be honest, it's just a flag now.
Sure.
It's not the same team, realistically. But I also think that was a great education for him. Frank is an inspirational figure. I know Lewis, for example, holds Frank Williams in very high regard. Claire Williams as well is a woman in F1 who has had to fight her way through a male-dominated and still a male-dominated And also, she's not only had the woman thing, she's had the Williams thing. People are like, well, why on earth have you got the job? A, you're a woman, and B, you're just his daughter. And I think actually she is a lot more talented than that. And, you know, to work alongside someone like that, I think is probably pretty inspirational, and you learn an awful lot.
And also the fact that it goes from that halcyon period of the 60s, the privateers are turning up and doing Crystal Palace and with Thruxton and William. If you don't know, Frank Williams lived in a house with at least three other drivers. One of whom was of course Piers Courage. The other one was Jonathan Williams, who no relation. He used to phone in my show on a regular basis. He drove a Ferrari in Mexico and also in Le Mans. And then it was but it was the great privateers. And back in the 60s and 70s, we had privateer teams, and it's a British thing as well. Garagistas, as Enzo Ferrari would call them, Chapman and Cooper and all that. So there's kind of a link to that, and George Russell strikes you as a very, yes, he's a bit European, but it's that very British driver, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so, and certainly the branding has lent into that. And his last race for Williams, he turned up in a three-piece suit as a sort of PR stunt for the Kingsman films, I think, which is you can see what that's trying to be, and it worked very well for all of the Williams branding. They had a martini deal at the time, and while he wasn't technically allowed to advertise it because he wasn't old enough, but it's complicated, but it was okay, and it kind of worked for their whole brand. And yeah, I think it's unfair, but one of the reasons that Lewis Hamilton hasn't been as wildly popular in the UK as he could have been is because people don't see him as that British. He's got this kind of mid-Atlantic drawl. He lives in Monaco. He spends a lot of time in Miami. He made that rather unfortunate comment about Stevenage at the Sports Personality Awards.
Oh, the ghettos of Stevenage.
Yeah, the slums, yeah. Which... Hey, well, Lewis, anyway, I'm not going to get myself in trouble.
Exactly. No, so yeah.
But by contrast, I think George is at home. George has only just moved to Monaco. He very nearly didn't move to Monaco at all. Unfortunately, by the way racing drivers are, they all end up there.
Yeah.
But he had a flat in London for a long time, and during the pandemic, him and his personal trainer went and moved back in with his parents, and I think he is a bit more homespun than most other racing drivers.
So he gets out of Williams finally, bittersweet in the whole thing. But Williams changes anyway, and you can't get a bigger, can you? You can't get a bigger arse than going to Mercedes and Hamilton, because that's the real. Many people go up alongside world champions and just wilt, stand up at the back, Nelson Piquet Jr. And etc. So therefore, it is the ultimate testing, and you live or die. And to be honest, a victory in there already, and many drivers don't get that. And a pretty solid job in a car that's not, as I said, it's not designed around him. He's still a big guy, and he's putting in solid performances.
And I think the crucial thing is that the whole thing is being viewed through a different lens because of the Sakir Grand Prix, when Lewis Hamilton had COVID and George had to jump into his car and should have won that race twice over.
Yeah.
And everything that came with that, the crying in the pit lane, it was so painful. And I think up until that point, if you had done one of these social media studies into the sentiment towards George Russell, I think overrated would have been a word that a lot of people had thrown around, because in the end he'd just been driving around at the back, and some people thought he was good, but most people were like, well, he's just British, that's the only reason you're talking about him as much. And then he gets into that car at almost zero notice. He's crammed into it, his knees are hurting, his hips are hurting because he basically doesn't fit in the car, and he effectively wins that race. Of course he didn't, but he effectively wins that race with his performance, and was let down twice by mechanical problems, and frankly a team cock-up.
Yeah.
And I think that drew him a great amount of sympathy and a great amount of respect. So when he got into that Mercedes car, he was kind of already on the front foot, and the fact that he then went and outdrove Lewis is obviously a huge boon, and I think a massive feather in his cap. Very few people, well, two, have done that in history, realistically.
And looking at it, of course, he's a difficult situation, because Lewis, like it or whatever he is coming to the end of his F1 career, and you can't see him trolling around in the lesser formula. He'll go out in a blaze of glory, and George has got to play a very difficult balancing game. He's got to respect the old Charger, Lewis Hamilton, the old Charger, but he's also got to show the fire to say, yeah, this is. We're not saying that again. Mercedes is an entirely different beast to Red Bull, for example, but he's going to be the number one driver within the next 2 seasons.
You would think so, and look, racing partnerships never last long. I actually have always wondered this stat. I've never managed to track it down, what the longest standing 2-driver partnership is, because it won't be longer than 2 or 3 years realistically. I suppose Schumacher and Barrichello at Ferrari, but that was always an awkward kind of relationship at the best of times. But yeah, it can't last realistically. 2 big egos alongside each other. And while George does a pretty good job of pretending he doesn't have an ego, of course he does. He's a racing driver. They all do. And yeah, he does kind of have to toe this difficult line. I think he's starting to largely ignore the line. You know, he's starting to say, no, hang on, I am quick here, and I think you should let me be quick. And there is a pretty obvious tension developing there. It'll be fascinating to see, you know, if Mercedes come out next year with a quicker car again and make another step forward. They're not going to be near Red Bull, but they might be, you know, on the same straight.
Yeah.
So we've got to have someone on the same straight as Red Bull at some point.
Yeah.
Then what happens at Mercedes? Then how do they manage it?
It's going to be interesting. And how do you think that Russell and everybody else? Because basically at the moment it is, you know, Max is out there and everybody else is also around. It's incredibly frustrating for these guys because they want to race and they haven't got the equipment to do it. And yeah, Max is a talent. It's not the car. He's exceptionally good, but he's an exceptionally good driver in an exceptionally good car, and it's demoralising for the rest of the field. So they're just having to turn up every Sunday and go, right, come on then, maybe something will break on the car this time round.
And it's absolutely disastrous for, like, you know, Formula One, which has spent years trying to make sure that lots of different people can win races, and then Max Verstappen wins 8 in a row.
Yeah,
it is a problem, I think. It'll be interesting to see how it looks next year because of the way the new regulations are with the rubber banding. You know, Red Bull will be heavily penalised for winning the title, as the rules say now. They won't get all the wind tunnel time they want. They'll have a few financial penalties, which, well, there's a whole other argument there, but I'm not going to get into it. So whether that works or not, I don't know. I think the gap is too big. I think the combination of Red Bull having one of the best aerodynamics departments in the world.
Adrian, of course.
Yeah, Adrian Newey. And Max Verstappen being a phenomenally talented driver. I think the combination of those two things makes it very hard to see anyone pegging him back, which is disastrous, frankly, for F1 and not bad for sales of my book about him.
Indeed, right then. And so, the book puts some flesh on the bone. We also look at the guy himself. I mean, away from the track, did you discover, James, anything? I mean, apart from partying with Fernando, who obviously is a god in Spain, because nothing, I mean, honestly, I tell you now, those first few races over here in Spain, Spanish TV coverage, where, you know, if it wasn't for those two, Fernando would be winning it. I mean, Sergio Perez, bit Mexican, that'll do it. It's Hispanic, and obviously when we had Sainz, Alonso, and Perez on the front, that was it. That was, you know, Feria for 3 days. That was so trust me on this one. So can we put you know, you've been able to put a bit more rather than just the results as well, and he's a flesh and bone human being.
On Max Verstappen?
No, on George.
I see.
Yes. I mean, Max, we're giving up on. You know, we can't see him. That's why he's gone.
Yeah, I think he's a really interesting guy. I think he's not maybe as rich a tapestry as someone like Max because he doesn't have that family association with the sport. I think he's a bit more straight down the line. But I think you have to look at him as someone who has not had many opportunities and has taken every single one he's had with both hands. I mean, there's a great story about, you know, meeting Ross Brawn in the toilets at an awards ceremony when he was about 12 years old and, you know, bothering to strike up a conversation with him, or getting hold of Toto Wolff's email address. Like, his manager, Harry, had got hold of Toto Wolff's email address and sort of said, well, it's just an email address. And so George's like, well, I'll send him my CV. I'll send him a cover letter.
Yeah.
Which I just love because it's like, well, he's a teenager. He needs a job. Like, what we all do that. We all did it as teenagers.
Dear Toto.
Yeah, exactly. to whom it may concern, I'm writing to inquire about the possibility of driving your Formula One car. And he did it, and Toto got back to him and said, let's set up a meeting, and they had a meeting, and, you know, George did a PowerPoint presentation, which is his sort of go-to special skill, and I think that's kind of the thing. He's always grown up with people much older than him. Like, his brother and sister are 12 and 13 years older than him. Obviously, then you've got his parents. You know, he's always been kind of the young'un in the room.
Yeah.
And so he's always had to kind of talk up. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic. And I think it's given him this sort of old soul.
Yeah, because if you look at him and Lando, exactly. That's all I need to hear. That's all I need to hear. Yeah, because Lando, Comedy Central, George, Lando class joker, George head boy.
Yeah, exactly. And there's only 2 years of age, or 18 months, I think, difference in age between them. And I know people who were at school with George, and, well, I say at school, he didn't really go to school like most professional sports people. By the age of about 14, he was doing homeschooling, but he was always that little bit cheeky, but I think it pretty quickly faded out of him. Maybe, he used to be a very good footballer, and I think when he was a footballer, he was a bit more kind of fighty and cheeky, but then it got to a point where he had to choose, and I think probably a young George Russell would have wanted to be a footballer more than he wanted to be a racing driver, but the decision was, I think, made for him, as most 10-year-olds' decisions are. Yeah, well, we're very glad it was. The book is called George Russell, a biography. It's by James Gray. James, if people want to find you online, as you said, you do a bit of writing, so where can people find you? I work for inews.co.uk, which is the website of the fine I newspaper, and you can find me on Twitter at James Gray Sport, which is where I'll plug everything I've ever done. Absolutely. And what's next in your line then, apart from the Watson biography of Maldonado, obviously, that I'm looking forward to? Well, I'm changing lanes a little bit next time. I think I'm going to write something about tennis, and I think that's all I'm allowed to say about it so far. Well, but it'll be interesting. We have it obviously here down in southern Spain. Djokovic is just around the corner in Marbella, so we'll get you back on for that one. But until we meet again, James Gray, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for having me, Giles.